So we are continuing our series on the book of Ruth, which we're calling It's Complicated. And this is a series on relationships. And relationships are complicated. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 3 today, and we are going to see that there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of tension in this particular part of the story. Relationships are tricky. They're complicated, especially romantic relationships and dating are tricky and complicated. And there was a study done back in 2019, pre-COVID. You guys remember 2019? Yeah, that was a while ago. But this study was done back then, and nearly half, 47% of all Americans say that dating is harder today than it was 10 years ago. So this is pre-COVID. So the number one reason given for this is there's more physical and emotional risk involved. That's why it's harder than it was. 57% of women, 35% of men say that they've experienced some kind of harassing behavior from somebody that they were dating. And for example, 42% of women say they've been pressured for sex. 25% of women say they've been sent unasked for sexually explicit images on their phone. And if you think about all the relatively new things that we have in our culture that just make things more complicated for dating. Dating apps, supposed to make things easier, probably make things more complicated. Sexting, there is internet pornography addiction is on the rise. The hookup culture that we have today, which really flows from the sexual revolution of the 1960s. There's the Me Too movement, which has drawn attention to sexual harassment and abuse. All these things are realities in our modern culture, and this is the landscape that we see. And most single people who are dating are also having sex. That's just the reality. Premarital sex is the norm. By age 20, 3/4 of Americans have had sex outside of marriage. By age 44, 95 out of 100 Americans have had sex outside of marriage. So this is huge. Here's the deal. Dating, though, the way we think of dating, it's so prevalent for us, it's very top of mind for us, really only been around for about 120 years. Has not been around that long, this modern idea of dating. And so this is a relatively new phenomenon. So here's my question. How can a book that's thousands of years old speak to this dating thing that's only been around really for a few decades? And I'm just going to make the crazy statement today that the Bible actually does speak to the challenges that we face today. In many ways, relationships are relationships, okay? There are new technologies, there are new challenges, but the tensions, the complexity, it's always been there. For example, that premarital sex stats that I was just giving you a minute ago, those have been relatively the same since the 1950s. And that always surprises people because they tend to think, oh, premarital sex is on the rise. No, it's actually really not. What's actually happening is people are now waiting longer to get married, and so they are sexually active and unmarried for longer. That's what's happening. And so it's the same risky activity, but more relational fallout. The same issues, but greater complexity. And there are stories and teachings in the Bible that speak to foundational issues that come up in relationships. Think about it. None of what we're facing today is a surprise to God. None of it surprised God. He has equipped us to deal with all the challenges of relationships. He's given us a pattern for relationships. That's my point. A foundation in the Bible. Now, we can choose to follow that pattern or not. I mean, that's obviously up to us. But let's be honest. We've been doing it our way for a while. How's that working out for us? It's not working out for us real well, is it? So, I've been in ministry for almost 20 years now, and many of those years were in youth ministry, and I have never once talked to a person who said, man, I wish that I had slept around more before I got married. I really regret that. Or I've never heard anybody say, I really wish I would have slept with that person before we broke up because that was a missed opportunity. No, they never say that. There's always this regret, like I wish I could go back and undo that. And they see the emotional wreckage in their life, and they make the connection. They go, this fallout in my life is because of these decisions. They start to see the connection. But this is where I need to pause and I need to talk about grace. I was going to wait to the end to talk about this, but I want to talk about it now. I want to make sure that it's front and center. Okay? I want you to know that there's grace and there's healing available to you, regardless of your story. Because here's what's amazing about Jesus. He can bring healing to any heart. Okay, God's grace removes our guilt, and his love heals our wounds. And some of us have messed up really big in this area. We're filled with regret. Others of us, maybe we've been abused by someone we thought we could trust, and we blame ourselves. We're filled with shame about that situation. And the good news of the gospel is this, that Jesus died on the cross, and when he died on the cross, he took our guilt and our shame on himself. So if it's our sin that we're talking about here, we can be forgiven. If it's someone else's sin and we're dealing with the consequences, we're paying for it, there can be healing for that. Through Jesus, we can be made whole. And here's the bottom line. Our pattern isn't working. Okay, that's the bottom line. If God has a pattern, let's maybe take a look at what that pattern is. And like I said, we're in Ruth chapter 3. And here's the story so far in a nutshell. If you want more of the story, I suggest you go back and you can look at or listen to the message from the last 2 weeks. But basically, because of a famine, a woman named Naomi and her husband and her 2 kids, they are 2 sons, they moved from Bethlehem to Israel in a foreign nation. They moved to a foreign nation called Moab, away from Israel. And Naomi's sons end up marrying women from Moab. And then all the men in the family die, Naomi's husband and her 2 sons, and leave the women alone. And Naomi now is destitute. She's left destitute. She's completely, she's in trouble. All right, she encourages her daughters-in-law. She says, hey, you guys should go back to your families. I'm going to go back to my hometown. We're going to part ways. We're going to go, maybe we can pick up the pieces if we don't stay together. And we see in Ruth chapter 1 that Ruth, one daughter-in-law goes home, but Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, commits herself to Naomi. And she says, no, I'm going to stay with you. I'm not going to abandon you. And there's a Hebrew word that's used in Ruth chapter 1 that we focus in on, and it's the word hesed in the Hebrew. It's translated kindness. But hesed love is the way that God loves. It's this committed, it goes the distance. It's this very committed type of love, and it's the kind of love that God shows. In Ruth chapter 2, Ruth goes to try to support herself and Naomi. She goes to the field, and she's gleaning some extra grain, and she ends up meeting the man who owns the field, and his name is Boaz. Boaz has heard about Ruth and the kindness that she showed to Naomi, and so he shows Ruth kindness in return. And Boaz encourages her to gather grain in his field. He offers her protection while she's gathering grain in that field. And when Ruth tells Naomi about Boaz, Naomi is really excited, and this is what she says to Ruth. This is in verse 20 of chapter 2. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. And what we learn is that God has been working behind the scenes to bring people together at the right time and the right place. And it turns out that Boaz is actually something called a guardian redeemer for Naomi's family. And a guardian redeemer is something that God built into his law. Basically, a close relative was always there as according to this law to make sure that everybody always had someone to advocate for them. So, for example, a guardian redeemer, they could restore property. They could purchase a relative. If a relative ended up in slavery, they could purchase a relative out of slavery. They could avenge a killing if one of the relatives got killed, or they could assist in a lawsuit, help with that, or ensure that justice is served for that relative. So because Boaz is a close relative of Naomi's family, he's in a place where he can step up and help them. In fact, he might even be legally obligated to step up and help them depending on the situation. In this case, what's at risk is Naomi's property. She has some property, but because she is a widow, in those days it was very rare for a woman to hold and control property, and so she is in danger of her property being lost, being taken away, which brings us to today's story. It's been a couple months since Ruth and Boaz first met, and Naomi begins to hatch a plan. Okay, her goal is to get Ruth and Boaz together. Now, marriage is not necessary for the land thing to get solved. Right now, Naomi's only thinking about marriage. She's not worrying about the land situation at this point. And so Naomi hatches a plan. It's a risky plan, It's actually kind of a risque plan too, as we're going to see as we jump into this. But let's pick up the story in Ruth chapter 3. It says, one day Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor." So the harvest season is over, this is always a time of great celebration of eating and drinking, and people are winnowing and threshing barley and wheat on the threshing floors, and they're celebrating the harvest. So a threshing floor is this kind of round, paved area where they would thresh and winnow grain. And the way you would thresh grain is you take the grain and you hit it on the ground, and the grain falls out of it, or maybe the head comes off of the stalk, and that's the first step. The second step is to winnow what you have left, and you kind of throw that stuff up in the air. The wind blows away the stuff that is not the grain, and the grain falls, and you end up with piles of grain on the threshing floor, which basically represents piles of income. And so that's why it was this time of great celebration. Like, look how much grain we have. It's very exciting. And so the plan is that Ruth is going to go visit Boaz at the threshing floor. So far, so good, right? Now, listen to what comes next. Now, imagine giving this advice, if those of you have daughters, imagine giving this advice to your daughter, or maybe to your sister, or something like that. And just think about it for a second. Naomi says to Ruth, "Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking." A woman and a man alone in the dark after eating and drinking alcohol. What could go wrong, right? Yeah, so it's kind of like, I'm not sure about this plan, Naomi, but look what comes next. When Boaz lies down, note the place where he's laying, and go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. All right. What? Naomi, she's like, "He will tell you what to do." Really? Okay, what kind of advice is that? I mean, just think about this for a second. To an outside observer, what Ruth is about to do, it looks no different than what a prostitute might do. And I'm telling you, the Bible is old, right? This story in particular is over 3,000 years old, but things haven't changed that much, right? Temptation is still temptation. Dudes are still dudes, right? This feels like a risky plan to me. That's all I'm saying. Remember, the stats on women who have been pressured for sex while dating, this could easily turn into a situation like that. And I think we need to realize, too, how many social barriers Ruth is breaking by going and doing this. She's a Moabite. She's a foreigner. Boaz is an Israelite. She's a woman who's going, basically propositioning a man. She's a servant who's going and visiting and asking a landowner. She's a poor person who's going to be addressing a wealthy person. She's a young woman who's going to be going and approaching a middle-aged man. Now, maybe we don't see all these as a big deal, but they're big deals in this culture. This could go all sorts of bad directions. So let's look at what happened. It's verse 7. This is great. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." Now, we don't get this idea as much in the English translation, but in the original Hebrew, there's a lot of sexual tension in this story, and we're going to see that the tension kind of increases as the story goes on. And scholars actually debate about this story quite a bit, if you can imagine, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. But isn't this a great moment where Boaz wakes up and it's like, wait, what? What's going on? And he turns and there's a woman there, all right? And the author doesn't even use the names of them at this moment. It's like the man woke up and there was a woman, right? And I think the author does that to emphasize just how confused Boaz is in this moment. Like for a moment, they are just a man and a woman alone in the dark. It's a very risky, awkward moment. And the author's trying to emphasize that. And Boaz asks, "Who are you?" And at this moment, this is the moment where Ruth goes completely off script. Okay? She doesn't exactly follow the plan that Naomi had laid out. Ruth is supposed to wait after being discovered by Boaz. Remember, he will tell you what to do. But instead, she says this. She says, spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Naomi's plan was to find a husband for Ruth. That was her plan. But Ruth has a bigger plan. She is asking for more than marriage. She's asking, really kind of telling, Boaz to step into his role as the guardian redeemer. And Ruth is very bold in this moment in advocating for herself and advocating for Naomi. And we need to notice that. She makes this request. She's very humble about it, but she makes this request in a very firm way. And actually, Ruth is combining two Israelite laws in this moment. There's the guardian redeemer law that obligates close relatives, like we've talked about, to come in and help people in times of hardship. But there's another law that Ruth is also referring to. It's called the Levirate law. And this is a law that said if a man dies without having any kids, especially any sons, then the brother of that man may be obligated to marry the widow and make sure she's taken care of and welcome her into his home. Now, that seems very strange to us, but the idea behind that is that women would be taken care of. Because like I said, women didn't usually own property. That was rare. And they wanted to make sure property couldn't be seized from women because she doesn't have a husband or doesn't have any kids. So Ruth actually takes these two laws and she puts them together. Ruth is asking Boaz to purchase this land that used to belong to Naomi's dead husband, Elimelech. But Ruth is also asking Boaz to marry her. So think about this. Basically, if Ruth and Boaz were to get married and to have a son, that son would actually count as Naomi's grandson, according to the law. Think about that for a second. It's very interesting how this could all play out. And so in the original Hebrew, when Ruth says, spread the corner of your garment over me, the literal translation is spread your wings over me. That's what she's saying. And so when Ruth and Boaz first met in chapter 2, Boaz said this to her. He said, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. He's talking about the kindness that she showed to Naomi by staying with Naomi. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. That's what he says. So now Ruth is asking Boaz to be those wings. She's saying, you need to be the wings. Ruth's goal is that Naomi is taken care of. Remember I said Naomi's goal is that Ruth gets a husband. But Ruth has a bigger goal, and that's that Naomi would be taken care of. And Boaz picks up on this. All right, and this is what he says. Verse 10. The Lord bless you, my daughter. He replied, this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it's true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl that you're wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then she went back to town. All right, so this is an amazing response from Boaz. He sees the kindness that Ruth has shown to Naomi, and he responds, and he's moved by that kindness. And we also see in these words that Boaz is smitten with Ruth. He really is, and it's not just the wine, I don't think. All right? And by the way, that word kindness in the Hebrew, that's our word hesed. That's that same word. And Boaz is praising Ruth for the hesed love that she's shown to Naomi. So there's some powerful lessons for us to learn from Ruth's actions and Boaz's words in this story. Some powerful lessons about relationships and romantic relationships in particular. But before we get into that, we have to address the elephant in the room, which is we know that Ruth and Boaz spent the night together, but the question is, did they cross the line? What actually happened on the threshing floor? And I'm telling you, scholars debate about this. They do. If you do any research, just a little bit of a Google search on this chapter, you'll see what I'm talking about. Like I said earlier, this story is filled with sexual tension. It's many scholars think this passage strongly suggests that they actually slept together that night. And like I said earlier, premarital sex between with single people is the norm now. It was probably common then too. So this is a culture when women are objectified and mistreated, and many things have changed, but many things still are the same, aren't they? So scholars point to a couple things in this passage as evidence that there was sexual activity. They point out that feet can be a euphemism for the male sexual organ. That uncovering, these ideas of uncovering and lying down, those are euphemisms for sexual intercourse. And if you add to that, the threshing floors were known to be these places of wild parties and bad behavior. So that's a thing too. And I just want to defend the character of Boaz and Ruth today, though. There are three reasons I do not think they crossed the line on the threshing floor. First of all, we see Boaz praises Ruth's character. He calls her daughter. And obviously Ruth was a nice-looking lady because he says you could be chasing these men if you wanted to be, and you're not. And when Boaz says you've not gone after the young men, whether rich or poor, he's suggesting that she has made a priority out of helping Naomi. She's not going to be a part of that. And what Boaz says to Ruth is about praising her character. He's not praising her physical appearance. And the best, and I just love the way that Boaz speaks to her. It's very respectful. Second, when Boaz says, "Stay here for the night," that word "stay" in the Hebrew is deliberately, I think, an unsexual word, a non-sexual word. There are other words that Boaz could have used if he was encouraging her to do something else. Now, I'm not denying that the atmosphere was probably sexually and romantically charged. That's still there in the passage. But the author wants us to know that despite that, these two didn't cross the line. And just because they didn't cross the line doesn't mean they didn't want to, obviously. They're still human beings. But last week we talked about how Boaz is a safe person. He's putting Ruth at ease and letting her know that he's going to respect her boundaries. And then Boaz has Ruth leave in the morning, and he says, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. And Boaz is a powerful enough man that if somebody was to see or to find out that Ruth spent the night, it wouldn't be his reputation that was ruined. It would be her reputation. Boaz, nobody's going to question him. Nobody's going to think less of him. And Boaz, and I'm not saying it's right, but that's just the reality. Boaz is concerned for Ruth's reputation, which means he's concerned about her. He doesn't want to do anything to hurt her reputation or to make her look bad. And I love what Boaz says to Ruth. He says, "I will do for you all you ask." Because Ruth came to him, she said, "I am your servant Ruth," but actually he's the one who's going to serve her, and he's going to do what she asks. And we're going to see what that is next week. All right, so here's how this part of the story ends. Verse 16. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." All right, so what are the things that we can take from this story to use in our own relationships? Well, remember, God has given us a pattern for relationships, especially romantic relationships. And I just want to give 5 things from this passage, 5 ideas to redeem romance. And I think there are some ideas here that we can apply to non-romantic relationships as well. All right? First of all, God should be your first love. God should be your first love. Ruth has demonstrated that she's a godly woman who cares about others. She's motivated by her love for God. Boaz is also a godly man. He's a safe person, right? He's committed to the well-being of other people. Both of them love well because they love God first. Right? That's why they love well. And the better we love God, the better we love those who are closest to us. If we make an idol out of people and we love them more than we love God, then eventually we're going to not love them as well as we could. Loving God first gives us the ability to love other people well. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, when first things are put first, second things are not suppressed but increased. And he's specifically talking about relationships in that quote. He's saying if we love people well, or if we love God well, then we're going to love other people better. All right, the second thing is feelings are not an excuse to take shortcuts. Boaz tells Ruth, I do want to marry you, but there is someone who is a closer relative to Naomi that's actually first in line. And if that person wants to buy the land, if that person wants to marry Ruth, then they have the legal right to do that. So Boaz is a man of integrity, and he isn't going to let his feelings for Ruth cause him to compromise that integrity. Even though Boaz is in love, he doesn't idolize love, and he doesn't let his love for Ruth run over all the rules. So often in dating, we take shortcuts. We overlook major character flaws in another person because we are being driven by our feelings. The third thing is it's good to have a plan and expectations. Naomi has a plan. Granted, it's a little bit of a sketchy plan. She's definitely banking on Boaz's good character here, but Ruth has her own plan that she's working on. And as she pursues a relationship with Boaz, she goes in with a plan and with expectations. One of the reasons that our modern dating scene is so messed up is we've surrendered love to the realm of feelings. We often separate thinking and planning from love. We don't have healthy relationships because we don't have healthy expectations for our relationships. It's a good practice, I think, to sit down and figure out, what are my expectations for a person that I would date? What are my expectations for a person that I would marry? Why am I dating? Ask that question. Just why do I want to date? What kind of person do I want to date? Have a plan. Have some expectations. Remember to hold yourself to your own expectations. Here's something that I need to say today. It's hard, but I think it needs to be said. If you're constantly finding yourself in bad relationships, if it might be time for you to take a step back from dating for a few months and ask some hard questions. What's going on in my heart? Ask yourself, why am I allowing unsafe people and unhealthy people to get so close to me? Ask that question. You might need to put a time limit on it. Like, I'm going to step back from dating for 6 months or for a year so that you can be clear-headed enough to think about these questions. All right? Fourth, purity creates passion and paves the way to intimacy. My wife and I have done premarital counseling for a few couples, and some of those couples have chosen to follow God's pattern, not have sex before marriage. And for these couples, the wedding day just crackles with passion because they have waited for this day. Purity creates passion. It does. And purity also creates the perfect environment for intimacy. Think about it. What happens when someone in a marriage relationship commits adultery? Well, it destroys intimacy, right? Well, purity for a marriage relationship, we understand that. We know purity for a marriage relationship means that sex stays inside that marriage. But here's the deal. Sex before marriage is still sex outside of marriage. And it destroys intimacy for future marriages as well. It doesn't matter if you plan to marry that person, if you're engaged, whatever. Purity paves the way to intimacy, and lack of purity destroys intimacy. Author Paul E. Miller says this: sexual intimacy outside of marriage is fed by an idolatry that puts pleasure before the commitments of covenant. It breaks God's speed limit by demanding immediate gratification. When that happens, love becomes disordered. If you have sex outside of marriage, you're basically saying, I want your body and I want to give you my body, but I don't want to give you the rest of my life. I don't want to give you myself legally, psychologically, permanently. I just want, let's just give each other just give one another our bodies, but let's keep our lives to ourselves. Let's stay independent. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. Here's number 5. It's never too late to pursue purity. I said this earlier, but we serve a God of grace, a God of new beginnings. There's always a fresh start available to us. And true, we might have to deal with the emotional consequences, the physical consequences of our broken relationships, the relational shortcuts that we've taken. True. However, when we give all of ourselves over to God, His Holy Spirit comes into our lives and begins that healing process. And our sin is taken away immediately. Now, I talked about God's grace earlier, but let me say this. If you want to place your trust in Jesus for the first time, if you are ready to say, Jesus, take my life, take my relationships, take my shame, my guilt, take my pain, take my joys, take my passion, take all of it. If you're ready to give that over to God, surrender that to God, and find new life, I would love to talk with you. I mean, that's the best decision you can make when it comes to your relationships. So there you have it. 5 ideas to redeem romance. And God has given us a pattern for relationships, including romantic relationships. And we see this pattern powerfully on display in this story that we just read. And my prayer is that we can all have relationships that follow the pattern that God has lovingly given us. We need God's redeeming love to transform all of our relationships. So let's look to Him this week.